Welcome to Brussels Forum 2020. We are pleased to introduce the Vice President for Foreign Policy at the German Marshall Fund, Dr. Ian Lesser.
Good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. Welcome back to Brussels Forum 2020. This is the fourth week. We're dealing with a bunch of very large, big picture issues that are affecting us on both sides of the Atlantic and globally. I hope you were able to join us earlier today. We had a really terrific conversation with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, and of course you can also watch it on brusselsforum.org if you haven't seen it. But we get to continue the conversation today and to focus in more on technology, but in fact, a set of issues at the nexus of health, technology, and the global economy. Let me thank our partners in Brussels Forum, our founding partners, Daimler and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our forum partner, Deloitte, and to all our associate and supporting and knowledge partners. We're really very grateful to all of you. And let me today add a special thanks to Microsoft for being a supporting partner with us again. The COVID-19 crisis and the future of the digital economy, that's our subject now. And I think when we talk about debate the consequences of the pandemic for economy, society, geopolitics, often we're talking about accelerators, the great accelerator, many have described it as. And I think we'll get an opportunity to talk today about whether that's the case in the context of the digital economy or whether it's something else. But we have a terrific group of people to join us for this discussion today, and I'll let our moderator introduce them in a moment. But let me thank and also introduce our moderator, Karen Kornbluh, Ambassador Kornbluh, my colleague from GMF in Washington, who is a senior fellow and also a director of GMF Digital. And with that, Karen, thank you again. Thanks to all for joining, and over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Ian. We're so lucky to be having this panel right now at this time. The US and Europe once again confront an unprecedented pandemic and an economic crisis. But whereas in the financial crisis of 2008, the world and specifically the transatlantic community came together to pull out of the crisis, today the US and Europe are confronting increasing tensions, specifically over a range of digital issues: digital tax, trade, how to treat the platforms, AI, any number of issues. So we're going to discuss today whether there are some win-win solutions that ensure that instead of a zero-sum approach, we're working together to strengthen economies on both sides of the Atlantic. We're very lucky to have this panel of transatlanticists who are also digital natives. So I think we'll be able to look under the hood and really come up with some interesting observations and hopefully policy solutions. I'm going to quickly introduce the panel. I'll begin with our European colleague. Eric Bothorel is a member of the French Parliament, where he is the co-chair of the Assembly's study group on data and the data economy, cybersecurity, and digital sovereignty. Congressman Will Hurd, whose background is in the CIA, as we'll hear, has been called by Politico and others the future of the GOP. He is also a board member of the German Marshall Fund. Congresswoman Suzan Delbene, we're so glad that she's joining us again. She was in Brussels last year for the Brussels Forum and made observations that are still with me today. She is a member of the House Ways and Means Committee and helps oversee our nation's trade policies on the Trade Subcommittee. She also has background, as do all of our panel, in the technology sector. And then we're very glad to have John Franks, also with Microsoft. He is president of United Nations Affairs at Microsoft. He's held a number of jobs at the company and has great insights. So thank you and welcome to everybody. I hope I got everybody's background correct. Okay. I was going to start with Congressman Hurd because of your background that I mentioned in the CIA we've seen how dependent we all are, we're witnessing it right now, on our digital networks right now. And as a result, we're also seeing how vulnerable we are to cybersecurity problems. And I wish you could tell us what issues have come up recently, what do we need to focus on, and how can we do that together, the US and Europe?
Sure, and I want to start off by thanking German Marshall Fund for inviting me to participate. And Ambassador, I'm a big fan of yours, so it's great to be on this panel with you. And Congresswoman Delbene is one of the leaders on these issues, and it's always a pleasure to be with my European friends. First off, let me apologize. I kind of live out in the woods in San Antonio, and there's a thunderstorm going on. So hopefully my connection will hold. But I think this is a broader question we're all having to ask ourselves: is access to digital infrastructure so that we can do basic functions. If you're going to be doing telehealth or distance learning distance learning, then you need to have access to the internet. And there's parts of the United States and parts of Europe where the digital divide is continuing to grow. And as we increase our surface area of attack because of the number of connected devices that we have, 20 billion probably by the end of this year, we need to do a better job of coordinating on intelligence when it comes to nation states as well as criminal organizations and what they're doing. And I think we need to change the paradigm in most of our countries, where we should be leveraging the understanding of different industries when it comes to digital attacks. And what do I mean by that? The banking system has a better idea of where the next Russian malware is going to come from and what they're going to attack. So we should be learning from industry. We, meaning the government, should take those assumptions and try to collect intelligence on those assumptions and get that information back to the private sector. I think the public sector and the private sector has to do a better job of not only just sharing information, but collaboration on defending these digital infrastructure. And ultimately, we need to begin with the presumption of breach. When I got out of the CIA and ran for Congress, I lost my first election. I don't tell that story anymore. But it gave me the opportunity to help start a cybersecurity company. And one of the things that, if you give me enough time, I'm going to get into your system. And so you have to begin with the presumption of breach. How quickly can you identify somebody in your system? Then can you quarantine them and kick them out? And I think in addition to an increased cooperation between the public and the private sector and in our individual countries, we should be improving that amongst ourselves. The first step we should do is do a better job at Five Eyes in order to start this and then broaden that out to broader participation. And also, you can't talk about cybersecurity without talking about artificial intelligence. The future of cybersecurity is good AI versus bad AI. And so if you're talking about AI, you have to talk about privacy. In the United States, we don't have a national breach standard. My friend who's going to talk is going to be talking about her way of solving it. I think it's probably the best solution that we potentially have out there. And so all of these issues are interconnected.
Thank you. That's a great setup. And since you mentioned Congresswoman Delbene, let's turn it over to you. As I said, you're a member of the Powerful Ways and Means Committee. You're co-chair of the Congressional Digital Trade Caucus, and trade has been a sticking point. Can you tell us about the importance of digital trade agreements in the COVID era and coming out of the pandemic, and how will these agreements serve as a foundation for the new, increasingly digital economy?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's great to be here again, even if it's virtually. And I think that's kind of the core of your question, is that we're all here virtually. I hope that next year we're able to meet in person again. And thanks everyone. This is a great panel to discuss these issues. And but we all know, whether you're in Texas, as Congressman Hurd is, or out here in Washington State, as I am, or folks in Europe, we are now dependent on digital infrastructure because of the pandemic. We were dependent before, but I think we've really all seen the incredible impact it's had on our lives, from communications to commerce to healthcare. Telehealth is been an important solution, and we've really accelerated a lot of different digital technologies forward because it's one way we've been able to help keep people safe and healthy. Given that, it really highlights also the inequities that result from that. So many people don't have good access in terms of either whether it's rural broadband or even access to basic technologies that they can use to access the internet, some type of device, et cetera. We've seen those disparities here at home in terms of education, where folks are trying to go online with education and not being able to have access. And so if we look collectively from a policy standpoint, we need to make sure we have policies in place that allow not only here in the United States, when we look at our domestic policy, but when we look internationally, that we have digital trade policies in place that really support the digital infrastructure that we're all so reliant on. And so when we look at that, I think it's important that we have global standards on things like a free and open internet, ensuring the free flow of data across borders, preventing data localization, and barring forced technology transfers. Those are kind of key elements that we look at. Data localization is going to be an even more important issue, especially for smaller companies, because it'd be harder for them to maintain a physical presence. And if you look at it now, even across the board, I think a lot of organizations are trying to think about what physical presence they need and try to understand how they might work given this experiment in telework that's happened and will affect the different industries in different ways. China's policies tend to get the most attention when we talk about many of these issues, but other G20 countries like India or Brazil or Indonesia have all proposed or implemented policies that could lead to digital protectionism. So when we think about what we're doing right now, what we're doing before the pandemic, but kind of the increased uses because of the pandemic, we know that these types of policies could really make it difficult to continue moving forward in the way we are. We also know that in addition to regulation, it's key that we extend the WTO moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. And we know the WTO is, in this new environment, doesn't really have a digital way of meeting and conducting business. And so that's also something that's been highlighted. But it's going to be harder for companies if that moratorium's not extended, particularly for small businesses to do business online. So we look collectively at policy, digital trade, but also all of the collective policies we do. And then I'll do the one shout out because Congressman Hurd also raised this, and privacy is such a huge issue. With so many people using technology, making sure that folks can protect their personal information is very, very important. Clearly, GDPR, the EU has moved forward here, but we need to make sure that we have domestic policy in place and also are using our voices at the international table too when we look at global standards, because that's obviously at the core of how people are going to interact with technology. They need to trust that they can protect their most sensitive personal information. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a big agenda. Mr. Bothorel, you've been involved in a number of digital issues, from competition in the telecommunications industry to a whole host of others, but we know that the digital economy and the physical economy are inseparable today. And I wonder if you could tell us from the French perspective, from the European perspective, what are the important digital issues that you're seeing in the recovery?
So thank you very much. I'm very pleased to join you today, even if it's not in real life, as we say. What about the issue? First, we go into details, some kind of number, just to be sure that what we learn from the lockdown period in France and its effect on the digital economy. 73% of French people say that they will continue on using digital tools, both for work or leisure, at the same extent, if no more, after the lockdown period. 42% of French people think that digital services played a positive role in their everyday life during the lockdown. So 30% of French people spent more than 6 hours a day in front of the screen during the lockdown. Only 15% of the French SMEs used e-commerce in 2018. And I will just give you one number. This is 2.5 million of long-distance medical consultation, which is really huge change compared to last year, since the beginning of the pandemic. That means that France is on the third place, if I compare to the other countries of the world, after China and US using long medical consultation, for instance. You asked me about the issue. We have some kind of issue for sure, and perhaps we have to challenge this now. Well, I will give you some kind of example. We have some hospitals, some hospitals face paralyzing cyber attacks. Perhaps it will say something to a previous development, or couldn't consolidate data on the national level because of the aging IT infrastructure. Some schools couldn't efficiently organize the continuity of their activity for thousands of underprivileged students. Some large companies discovered the obsolescence of their hardware or couldn't organize remote working correctly. Many small businesses couldn't pursue their activity online because they didn't offer digital means of payment or didn't have a website. That's really critical, really, in France. At the end, the social distanciation that served as means to contain the coronavirus was essentially a physical distanciation, and most of our activities and social interaction have been transferred to the digital universe. The economic history teaches that the drastic changes in the means of production and consumption, which are caused by any crisis over less over time, in a form of ratchet effect, which we say effet cliquet in France. The great digital leap that we experience will have many consequences for public institutions and businesses. With a massive effort to upgrade our infrastructures, hardware and organization, France and Europe face to risk an unprecedented economic downgrade. The digital uses, and it will be the end, that have been developed during the lockdown period consolidate the superiority of extra-European solutions. We are using Zoom at this time. The nomination of the so-called US big tech company raises the question of the European digital sovereignty and the willingness for public authorities to invest massively in their domestic ecosystem in order to create European digital leaders. Well, you got a number for France. You have some kind of, I figure out some kind of issue we have around economy or health, and perhaps one or two or three beginning of where we can follow to make sure that we can be better after the crisis.
Thank you. It's very, very helpful. John, I wanted to ask you, I wanted to bring in China to the conversation. I thought you could shed some light. We see on both sides of the Atlantic that leaders are starting to talk about national champions, or at least take a national point of view in terms of international competition. And I wonder what the transatlantic community can do to avoid undermining the global trade system while at the same time better competing with China.
I think Eric's phrase, the great digital leap, I think brings to mind just the recognition of how important digital infrastructure is and digital services. And I think we've seen the great advances in digital transformation, but also acceleration of the digital divide. So businesses that were able to have the equipment, network infrastructure, and the nature of the business that let them keep working during the crisis remotely suffered less productivity loss. Other businesses really at a standstill. We had 1.38 billion children get shut out of school. And so some of those children were able to get some online education. We can learn from that and do better, but still a huge number of children left behind. And so I think there is a clear need to try to think about how do we create a more resilient infrastructure. And at the same time, we do have concerns. I mean, we saw this, if you will, every country for itself on medical equipment. We still see it playing out on vaccines. There is a retreat to nationalism. And so I think there's a challenge and this time of crisis about how do we work across borders, even within the European Union, to build the future for ourselves. I think the transatlantic relationship is hugely important there, and we see some tensions over digital tax and some potential tensions over what people how would they define digital sovereignty. And we're at the same time, we are seeing a separation increasingly of technology from East and West. You know, the 5G debates and the Trump administration policies have set in motion a dynamic that, whether you agree with it or not, is clearly happening. So what we need to do is try to think about how do we work together more constructively. I think, you know, 5G is a good opportunity as we want to build back a more resilient infrastructure for having made the digital leap, and you know, we'll continue to see a number of people working from home. We may see lockdowns take place again, and we're going to need to be able to educate children during those periods. But with 5G, there's a new generation of technology, more software-based, less based upon, you know, proprietary hardware, that will lower the capital cost for telco operators and increase the deployment. But we need to work cooperatively on those standards. We also need to share to sort of learn about economics of how do you run an auction so that it promotes more competition, more coverage, and facilitate sharing of expensive equipment by competitors as they compete to deliver service, not just to build out infrastructure. So I think that those conversations can take place. You know, in Europe, there's the Gaia X initiative initiated by France and Germany, and we've been supportive of it. It is important that countries feel that the infrastructure that's being built is being built and operated in conformance with their values. And the opportunities that are created from that should go to local participants. If society's not benefiting from it, that's a problem. So there's going to be a great deal of transformation that will continue because of the digital leap. But we are going to have to work hard to bridge some of the differences in privacy and security and other areas, so that especially North America and Western Europe can take the same path.
That's great. I feel like we've set the table with a whole host of issues, from trade to cyber to privacy, 5G. And I just want to get a couple of other issues out there, tax and AI, that dig in a little deeper on some of the ones that we've already raised. But I just want to let folks know that if you want to ask a question, please either tweet to hashtag Brussels Forum or send an email to brusselsforum@GMFUS or German Marshall Fund US.org. And we'll be taking the questions in just a little bit. Tax, I thought maybe Congresswoman Delbene and Monsieur Bothorel or anyone else who wants to talk about it. A few weeks ago, the US announced that it would follow on its investigation of France's digital services tax with similar investigations into the EU and several of its member states. There's this implicit threat of tariffs that sometimes actually becomes explicit. And the US just withdrew from the OECD negotiations on digital taxes. Is this on a slow burn? Is it going to erupt? How do we solve these issues? And you know, what does it mean for the ability of governments to have sufficient funds to pay for the recovery efforts if we haven't solved this digital tax issue? Congresswoman, do you want to try to tackle this tough one first?
Sure. This is a critical issue. And so thanks for bringing it up, because I've been supportive of the OECD process. I think that we are behind in terms of thinking about how we look at digital technologies and digital policy, but also in how we look at tax policy in particular. I don't think that unilateral discriminatory digital services taxes are helpful. I think they're counterproductive, and I think it can undermine the OECD process. We need folks coming together to solve these issues. I also recognize that there's a strong feeling out there that many large technology companies aren't paying their fair share of taxes, and due to a failure to update the tax code for a digital economy. And I think that if we look at that across the board, we really need to think about what a tax code looks like in a digital economy. Tax code was really based on physical goods and physical presence primarily. And I don't think we've collectively done a good job in terms of being more forward-looking about how we change that. And so I do think that the OECD process was critical to that, of bringing folks together to have that conversation. I think that Secretary Mnuchin's letter, was surprising to many of us. These negotiations are difficult, but we've got to figure out how to all come to the table to resolve them. So I hope that that work will continue to get things back on track, to make sure that we have a multilateral agreement, because really in the end, I think that's the only way that we make sure that we have transparency, we have predictability on these issues, and we continue to have policy that's up to date with the way the world works today. Clearly, it's a challenging time, and so we're going to have to continue to work through that. But your concern that you raised about kind of escalation and retaliation won't be a way that we resolve this issue. I think we've got to come together, and I think the OECD process is the best way to do that.
And Mr. Bothorel, what is your feeling about this? Do you think the OECD process can get back on track, and what will Europe be doing?
I hope so. Well, to be honest, I'm not, even if I'm part of the majority in France, I'm not really a fan of digital tax country by country. And remember that the President Macron tried to join each country of Europe to have this initiative around a digital tax that could be common. And not only in Europe, but first in Europe. Well, doesn't success. Like the tracing software, tracing application, if I can compare for something more recent, but okay, it was not a success. And the government decided to launch a digital tax in France, saying that at the end, if we find an agreement on the OECD work, well, we leave the digital tax in France for the solution coming from the OECD, for instance. But it takes a long time now that the OECD work around several propositions. A lot of people around the table say, okay, I agree with that. We'll do that. And it's taking a really long time. And this time, now the US say, because they said before that they agreed that we have to work on this OECD approach, but they say we leave and we give up this one. This is not really surprising. This is a pity, because if we cannot have a common approach, well, we will never find the solution to move from the traditional economy to the digital economy that change the approach around taxing, because we tax the country of production compared to the country of consumption. We know this is a game changer and could be a key change for regulate more fairly the business and the competition between each competitors, even they are Chinese or they are US or they are European. So this is not really good news. In France, we have the digital tax at this time, and until the time we don't have a solution coming from Europe or from OECD, well, we will sustain and maintain the digital tax. But really, I'm not really a fan of that, because each time you create a space like a hell, well, you generate a space like a paradise. You know, we use the paradis fiscal for in word in France. So I'm not totally naive.
That's great. Just sticking with the OECD for a second, I want to ask about AI of both Congressman Hurd and John. The G7 members have agreed to join the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, which will be housed at the OECD. And this global partnership hopes to support and guide the responsible development of artificial intelligence that's grounded in human rights, inclusion, diversity, innovation, and economic growth. What do you think about AI and specifically facial recognition? I know Microsoft has made some announcements on this in recent weeks. And in light of the protests, I think there's been even more concern about the use of some of these technologies. What do you both see about the prospects for developing it in a way that avoids the obvious pitfalls? And I want to start with the Congressman.
Sure. So ultimately, like the broad strokes, we should be strengthening our alliances, not weakening them, and finding those forums in which we can have these tough, difficult conversations is important. And instead of focusing on one particular technology or use of technology like facial recognition, the real issue is bias, right? And how do you address bias within an algorithm, and how do you correct for bias? How do you identify it? And it all comes down in how you use your data. It comes in the design of your algorithm and the auditability of your algorithm as well too. And right now I'm working with a colleague of mine from Illinois, Robin Kelly, on working on a national strategy for artificial intelligence that addresses not only research and regulatory laws around it, but also this important issue of bias. And ultimately, I believe that we have rules that say you can't discriminate against somebody giving them a loan to get a house. Okay, that's already on the books. The algorithm, if the algorithm does that, then that's violating the law, right? Let's use their existing laws and make sure that this technology follows through on it. And whether it is the implementation of the technology or it's the algorithm ourselves, that's how we have to understand the regulatory issue. We also need to understand how much data do we actually need in order to train, because not having enough data to train, and I think this is potentially one of the issues around facial recognition. So what are our standards on that data that goes into these algorithms? And so these are all questions that we can't just answer ourselves, right? We have to work with our friends. And let's be honest, the transatlantic divide on these issues of privacy and security are not as large as they are with our ways and values it is with China. China doesn't care about civil liberties. They're going to try to continue to export authoritarian tools to other administrations, right? And so I came into Congress at the beginning of the GDPR debate, and I was one that's like, this is protectionism, this is going to be bad. And then I realized after it's been implemented, I go to a lot of websites with cookies, So it may be Pollyanna-ish of me to think that we're not that far away on these topics, but we should be having these conversations with our friends, and we shouldn't only be talking about the negative aspects of these technologies. Yes, we need to prepare for them, but we should be thinking about how can we improve data, training our algorithms by sharing data amongst ourselves, right? And we should be looking at the positive application. And I'll just end. I feel like all of these issues we're talking about lead to artificial intelligence, because truly mastering this tool is going to give such an advantage. And second place doesn't exist when it comes to the mastery of artificial intelligence. And we have to get our act together, and we have to stop having these arguments that I think are not as our difference of opinion across the Atlantic is actually not that different.
Yeah, I just want to underscore that a bunch of the themes that you just stressed are ones that in our program, GMF Digital, we've been stressing, which is the need to update some of our offline laws for the online world, whether it's consumer protection or, as you raised, civil rights, just generally human rights that include privacy rules, our national security frameworks for these online challenges, but also, as you also said, grab the opportunities in this changing world to improve life at home, but also to compete with China. So, I just want to draw folks' attention. We did a roadmap on securing digital democracy. Ellen Goodman, who's one of our fellows, and I wrote, and so I recommend that to our audiences. But I just want to give John a chance to talk from the company side about AI, and picking up on the congressman's points about the opportunity it offers, the importance of being able to compete, and how we protect against the downsides.
Yeah, it is an extremely important question because, and from the technology industry's point of view, you have to look back and say we've often created technology, put it out into the world, and assumed it all be used for good. And in fact, technology can be used for good or not good purposes. Brad Smith's book last year, Tools and Weapons, talks about the dilemma that technology can be used different ways. And so we've called for regulation of artificial intelligence, and starting with the use case of facial recognition technology, because the particularities of that are important. As Congressman Hurd said, the bias problem is very real, and we need to address that. But it's also the application. When is it appropriate to use it? Facial recognition technology was incredibly important, for the British police to be able to figure out what happened with the Skripal poisonings in Salisbury. But it was done under controlled means and in ways that we can feel, there was protections in place, that people's liberties were carefully considered. We don't want to have constant surveillance. There were some reports of how military planes were used during the recent protests in the United States. And I think that's deeply disturbing to many people, that people going to a peaceful protest should be identified by their government, categorized. And we think that those kind of uses are not positive. And so it is important to have considerations, and with absent regulation, you do face the possibility of kind of a race to the bottom inside an industry. If you're going to rely just on ethics, well, then only ethical companies are going to be doing that, and not every company is going to have the same commitment to ethics and human rights. So I think it is an important initiative at the OECD to bring together. I think it's important for North America and Europe to insist on high standards for us, because together we can set the standard for the world. And I think that it's important that we say that we're going to buy technology from providers who always follow high standards, not companies that are willing to go to low standards where they can and high standards when they need to.
Ambassador, can I jump on for 30 seconds, something that John inspired?
Yes, please.
So, we also have to make sure, like, we shouldn't create some, department of artificial intelligence that's responsible for like regulating AI across everybody. It's all the existing regulatory bodies and agencies have to better understand this stuff and be part of this. And so it's their responsibility, whether it's the FEC in the US dealing with financial services companies, or the FTC, or the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Each one of those entities needs to make sure and understand how can artificial intelligence be used or abused within their industries, and everybody has to be responsible. And that's why we got to make sure that we're educating folks, and that we have people that understand these tools and technology in all walks of life. And we should also be thinking about development is different than deploying when you're actually going to be touching consumers, right? You can maybe be a little bit more lax in the development stage, but when it comes time for rollout to the population, you have some of these incredibly high standards. And so, like I said, I don't want, and I'm not implying that John's saying that there should be a department of artificial intelligence, but we shouldn't be thinking that way, and we have to force everybody to be thinking about this, not just one entity that's going to solve this for all of us.
It's so interesting. So another agenda item for us is, how do we think about updating not just the overarching policies, but just the work of our government agencies. So they, and not just the knowledge of the workers there, but the regs that they've put in place, what makes sense and what doesn't in this new era. But I want to pick up on the training piece of that and take it, spread it out a little broader than the public sector to the private sector too. And I'm sure everyone has thoughts on this. But as we move into this digital era, as we take, this is our new catchphrase for the panel, the digital leap. As we take the digital leap, how do we make sure that more people aren't left behind? We're having these global conversations about who's been left behind and how do we close the gaps in inequality, and yet at the same time, this digital leap may widen the gap. So what do we do to combat that? I don't know who wants to take that first. Mr. Bothorel, do you want to talk a little bit about training and what we do for the jobs of the future?
Well, in fact, in France, we discussed this for yesterday with Federico. I think we identified the issue we have. We have two kinds of different issues. First of all, is the 13 million people that not really aware with digital tools. And then there is a specific action for them. We have to find some training to put training in place very close to them. That means in very small town with a dedicated area for that, public area for perhaps, which is not only a training area. And we do our best around that with Pref Numérique. That means it's 500 euro available for people that want to be trained around that. Perhaps it's not really enough. Perhaps we have to do more. But this is for this kind of population. And we are the other one. The other one is the very young people. They are not totally equal. There will not be each of them digital native. They will use digital thing, but perhaps they are not really aware about the cyber risk. They are not really aware of what they expose of from the data to the real life. And then we have to train that to train that then better than what we do at this time. I make a proposal yesterday that could be a cyber challenge for people that are 14 years old, for instance, a national cyber challenge, and could be a European cyber challenge for people from this class of age. This is not the alpha, the omega of the solution, but we have to do more initiative around the training around. This is not only mathematics and culture and this is not only coding or building a robot. I think we have to make a pressure around the cyber thing if you want to have people aware of that, and perhaps want to have a career around the cyber. We know we have a lot of difficulties to have women around cyber, for instance. So if we are waiting for the end of the study, we will have the same result at this time. So we have to change, we have to move, and I think we have to go in more soon in the common training, to have specific training and dedicated training around cyber, for instance. And it could be by the game. That's the reason why I suggest to have a national cyber challenge for people 14 years old, for each of them.
That's great. So now we have the digital leap and the digital challenge. So we have two headlines from the panel. Does anyone else want to talk about the labor issue and how we make sure that our workforce is ready for the digital leap?
Can I come in?
No. Go ahead, John.
So,
go ahead.
Well, every business is clearly digital now, and so every business has a technology component to it. So every business has an interest in, and governments to deliver services need to increasingly become digital and rely on more technology. So it's the skill set that we need to develop. It's just, I'm not saying it's the only skill, but clearly there's a need for growing digital skills. And as we think about the economic recovery, we've talked about investing in infrastructure. Well, I think it's important that we also think about investing in our people and our human capital, and skilling them up. We're going to have people whose jobs may not come back or will come back slowly. And it's an opportunity and a challenge for them personally, but by investing in them on digital skills, we know that there's going to be demand in the economy for that, and it helps the productivity. People talk about, are we going to have a V-shaped recovery? Well, it could be more of a W-shaped recovery or a WWW recovery as we go through the different phases. But investing in human capital, skills training, and recognizing that online skills training in bite-sized pieces can be hugely important, and it's something that people can build in to their daily lives without having to go off to university or something.
I wanted to add first on the basic access side of things that, I represent one of the biggest technology hubs in the globe, and yet you can go an hour away from where I am now and be in a part of my district where there's not rural broadband or even good cell service. So access is key, because you're not able to have those same educational opportunities to get that training. Those jobs aren't in those locations because they don't have a basic infrastructure for economic development. So businesses don't want to go to these smaller towns or towns in these areas, even though they might think they're beautiful places and have other attributes that are positive. If you don't have basic infrastructure there in terms of broadband, it's may not mean that you can set up your business there. And so we create this kind of ongoing vicious cycle and create more and more inequities there. So we've solved problems like this in the past, electrification, et cetera. We can solve this. There has to be a will to do that, and there's not always going to be a profit motive that's going to drive it. So I think the public sector has an important role to play there to really provide that access. And I want to emphasize, Will brought this up, and so did John, the ubiquity, because it's not just training people for jobs in the technology industry. It's not just policies that address the technology industry. This is every industry. Everyone has technology needs now. I think you'd struggle to think of any sector of our economy that hasn't been impacted from innovation and technology and change, and obviously the government as well, that was brought up earlier. So when we talk about the skills that are needed, we traditionally talk about programming skills, making sure that everyone can write code. And we talk a lot about science, technology, engineering, and math and STEM. But I want to also talk about how important it is that we think about how people interact with technology. And so I'm a big fan of science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, STEAM, because the user interface, understanding how people interact, understanding cultural differences or bias has to be part of this digital education that we provide if we're really going to not only serve everyone in the globe, but also make sure we address the issues of civil rights, civil liberties, and human rights in a digital world. Because we talk about the digital leap, as you were saying, but we've leapt already. And so we've got to make sure that we catch up, because I think we're behind. And in the end, folks will only engage, learn, and move forward if they trust in technology. And that's why fundamental policies like privacy, addressing issues like AI are so important, because we have to build that trust. And most people, I think, when technology first came out, assumed, John brought this up, that that it was, everything was for good, and assumed that a lot of their rights were protected in a digital world in the same way they were in a physical world. And we haven't kept up there. And so as policymakers, we have an important responsibility to do that. But I think we all have to be critical about how we continue to make sure that technology is living up to that same standard.
So maybe that's another kind of tech digital challenge, is making sure that our values and our frameworks are reflected in the new digital world. I wanted to pick up on the connectivity issue, and as you say, access to broadband is such a gating issue for just getting access to the economy now. But one of the issues we're talking about is 5G, and when that came up earlier, and the issue with Huawei. And Congressman Hurd, I just want to ask you, this is such a tough issue. China is well ahead, as was brought up earlier. We don't even have the spectrum situation cleared out for 5G here, and that impacts downstream industries and upstream industries. And this question comes from one of our listeners and watchers. Is it time? Is there anything the U.S. can do in the 5G race? And is it time for us to start working with Europe on the next generations, on 6G, on 7G? How should we think about not just the 5G race, but what it means for our, upstream industries like semiconductors and our downstream industries like autonomous cars?
So the answer to both those questions is yes. There is something that we can do, not only just the U.S., but with our allies, and we should be working with our allies on next generation technology. And let's start with, why does 5G matter, right? 5G it's going to be great to download a 4K video on my phone in 4 seconds, right? Because I'm on the plane, not so much now, but I'm on 8 flight segments a week at a minimum. But the latency that 5K is going to give us, right? So we do something on our phone, it hits the cloud, and it comes back. That is going to be done. That latency is going to be 10 nanoseconds, right? Why does 10 nanoseconds matter? We think in 8 nanoseconds. So we're going to have the entire power of the internet behind us. What is that going to allow us to do? I don't know, right? I think some of us have some ideas. And so why is China fixated on 5G? Because they want to own all the companies that operate on top of 5G, right? And that is why this race, those are going to be the next trillion dollar companies. And what should we be doing? We should be look. If you only have Nokia, Samsung, and Ericsson as the people that can provide these the antennas and some of the infrastructure that's needed to actually make a 5G network, how are we going to be able to support them as competitors? Can governments be doing longer term contracts on some of these issues? When we here in the US, as we look about another stimulus package to deal with the COVID-19 crisis, can we be helping state and municipalities grow their infrastructure in their communities so that we can provide better digital facing services? And so we have to think about using all levers of power in this fight. Because now I know in my travels within Europe and talking to senior cybersecurity officials are like, hey, I hate to break it to y'all, but y'all have already lost the 5G race. I think we can catch up. It's going to be difficult, but we can't do it alone, especially when some of the companies that we're going to have to rely on are not American-based companies. And so this is where we have to start being a little more creative. And then, sharing research when it comes to next generation technologies, because at the end of the day, it starts with our values. We share the same values. And we're going to be, the only way we're going to solve these big problems is by doing it together. And this notion of, looking inward and not caring about international institutions, that's the wrong way to go. We have to be strengthening our alliances, not weakening them. And that's going to help us take advantage of technology before it takes advantage of us. And Ambassador, I didn't mean to correct you. I needed to correct you. Something you said at the very beginning. I'm actually not a digital native. I appreciate you thinking I'm so young. I didn't have a cell phone until I was a junior in in college, until my junior year in college. And the training that's going to be required, you don't have people that can teach this stuff in high school and middle school. So folks in the private sector that are doing this are going to have to be ambassadors to these schools. So when those teachers have questions on how to teach it, they can go to someone. And I do believe that code, if data is going to be the future coin of the realm, then coding is a lingua franca. And we should be introducing coding in middle schools so that kids understand it. You know, we're not teaching cursive anymore, you know, so that we should be teaching coding, and we got to make sure that we have folks that are doing this, that are supporting our educators, because they don't exist. Sorry for the long answer, Ambassador.
No, and correction accepted, and apologies. And what I meant to say, you didn't let me get away with my mistake, is fluent. I think this panel, what's interesting about everybody on this panel is you're familiar with the policy, you're familiar with the business, with the economics, but you also understand that these are not separate from digital issues. And that's what I think is so fascinating about this conversation. But thank you for that. I just want to take it back to sort of a more pedestrian or maybe near-term issue. It's not pedestrian at all. Mr. Bothorel raised the tracing and tracking issue and what France has been trying to do there. And John, you talked about the recovery, and is it a V, is it a U, is it two W's? A question came from our audience, from Chris Schroeder, who's also on the board. And he points out that a number of Asian countries are already reopening. They've really seemed to have squashed a lot of the pandemic within their borders. John and Mr. Bothorel, what do you think we could be doing on the tracing side? Does that hold hope? How do we really start that upward trajectory of the economy?
I think the technology companies have put a lot of effort into trying to build apps that will kind of automatically track and trace or enable tracing. And it's led to some fascinating, insightful thinking about how do we preserve privacy in that context. And so I think that we've actually probably done more to advance privacy thinking in this than we may public health. But you know, these apps are still, we'll see how they do. But you know, broadly speaking, you know, we've been working with customers, including like the World Health Organization and national and local governments, about how they use data in this time. And I think there is an increasing awareness that being able to gather data, there's more opportunities to analyze it in ways that are insightful and meaningful, and to have a science-guided approach to public health here is truly important. Now, we don't have the same necessarily legal regimes in place, but it is, you know, when one looks at Europe and the curves versus the United States still continues at a surprisingly and a disappointingly high rate of new cases. So I think that we do need to do more. I think that masks may be more important than cell phone apps, though.
I do agree. I do agree with that, even if, well, I'm a little bit disappointed that we cannot find a common approach across Europe around the tracing app, for instance. And the debate was more centralized or not or decentralized storage of the data. But we will do better next time, because we will need this kind of tool. We will need this kind of tool. This is not the beginning of the end for the COVID-19. It's not the end of the end. Perhaps it's the beginning of new things. So I think we have to be prepared to face off this kind of a challenge, which should not perhaps not be a pandemic crisis, but could be a systemic cyber crisis. That it's I make really a parallel between what we touch in terms of effect with this pandemic crisis. According to me, this is such as a perfect systemic worldwide cyber attack. That means you have to stop your economy. Well, if you do that one time each 10 years, you can face off that. If you have this one each week, it will be very difficult. So you have to be prepared. That's the reason why, if you have a pandemic crisis again, and perhaps we have a pandemic crisis again, surely we have a pandemic crisis again compared to this one, when we have to be prepared. And we will have, again, this debate around the fact that we have to centralize or not decentralize. But in France, we decide to have the approach with privacy first. And I perfectly understand that some other countries, with their culture, with their history, consider that privacy could be operate, including private companies such as Apple, for instance. You know, when I went to the Comdex, to the CES for the 2 years now, the biggest advertising that there was on the wall was something compared to the GDPR, very compliant. It was an Apple advertising saying, what happened on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. Well, so you can consider that Apple will be a player of the GDPR, for instance, that we have to play with them.
That's great. We're almost at the end, but I just wanted to see if either Congresswoman Delbene or Congressman Hurd, if you have any thoughts about that you can share with us to close out about the recovery, about the use of apps, and these important issues about privacy and surveillance that were just raised.
Well, you know, we started a little bit with privacy, and we're still discussing privacy, and we've even put forward, you know, I've helped put forward legislation to make sure that we have privacy protections in place for contact tracing. It would be important if we had really foundational privacy policy across the US, that we had global standards and that we were continuing to build on that, because I do think that that's foundational. And that would really set the stage, because, you know, we talk about contact tracing, for example, trust is so important. If folks are going to use an app, if they're going to interact and provide information, it's going to be because they trust that their information is going to be used responsibly, that folks are following policies that were laid out, and that they can see and understand what those are. We can do this. I'm very passionate about this issue and getting legislation through, because it is so foundational in terms of, we need to build off of that to provide other services, not only to address a pandemic and help with a public health response, but to issues of artificial intelligence and all those other things really build on top of that. So I do think that's a foundational piece, and critically important as we look at really all the issues that we've brought up today that we have to address if we're truly going to have policies that are up to date and make this digital leap as you talked about. So I want to thank everyone for really highlighting how important it is that we move forward and address these issues from a policy perspective.
That's great. Congressman Hurd, will you close us out?
Well, I was just going to say amen, sister, because what my colleague is saying is absolutely. We have a great opportunity here, right? The technological change we're going to see in the next 30 years is going to make the last 30 years look insignificant. And we're going to be able to do things in our lifetime that we never even thought about. And we can achieve those things and manage the risk associated with that. And the only way we're going to be able to pull that off is if we do it together. So thanks for y'all's time. Thanks for the invitation.
Great panel. Thank you all so much. We were really lucky to have you.